The Krieger ate his rations while his intestines hung from his stomach. He had tucked them back inside his flak armor as neatly as possible, cinched his webbing tight, and continued his watch rotation. When I ordered him to the medica station, he turned those dead glass eyes toward me and asked in that muffled monotone if his combat effectiveness had fallen below acceptable parameters. The wound was 9 hours old. He had killed 4 heretics in that time. His data slate showed he had filed 3 situation reports, maintained his Lazarifal, and redistributed ammunition to his squad, all while his organs slowly necrotized inside a makeshift compression bandage he had fashioned from a dead comrade's greatcoat. I am Commissar Velen Harrow, and that was my introduction to the Death Korps of Krieg. Not in some after-action report or tactical briefing, but standing knee-deep in the frozen mud of Atria Secundus, staring at a man who had weaponized his own dying with the same efficiency he applied to cleaning his bayonet. I have served alongside 17 different regiments across the segmentum obscurus. I have watched Catachan devils tear orcs apart with their bare hands, screaming with savage joy. I have seen Cadian shock troops hold impossible positions through sheer bloody-minded pride. I have executed cowards and burned heretics, and put lasguns to the heads of men begging for the Emperor's mercy. None of it prepared me for the Death Korps. None of it could. The worst part was not the wound. The worst part was the complete absence of pain in his voice when he asked me that question. Combat effectiveness, parameters, as if he were a servitor querying its tech priest for maintenance schedules. As if the meat that was failing inside his body was just another equipment malfunction to be logged and reported. I told him to get to the medica. He saluted, turned, and walked 17 steps before his legs gave out and he collapsed face first into the mud. His rifle never touched the ground. Even falling, he protected the weapon. Even dying, he maintained discipline. When the corpsmen finally cut away his flak armor, they found he had written his identification number on his exposed intestines with a grease pencil, so his body could be properly logged when they scraped him out of the trench. That is when I understood that the Death Korps of Krieg are not soldiers in any way the Imperium traditionally defines the term. They are something else entirely, something that wears the shape of humanity like a uniform, something that has hollowed out every human instinct and filled the void with a singular, terrifying purpose. The galaxy knows them as the Emperor's most fanatical warriors, the regiments that march into minefields to clear them with their own bodies, the siege masters who measure victory in acceptable losses rather than tactical advantage. The propaganda reels show their gas-masked ranks advancing through chemical firestorms with mechanical precision. The Imperial Tarot calls them the Penitent Legion, the Atonement Made Flesh. Every child in the Schola Progenium learns their name as a synonym for sacrifice. But nobody talks about what that sacrifice actually costs. Nobody speaks of what happens to a mind when you strip away fear, hope, and the basic human desire to survive. Nobody asks what remains when you take a child and spend 2 decades teaching him that his only value lies in the manner of his death. The Departamento Munitorum celebrates their casualty rates as proof of devotion. The Ecclesiarchy holds them up as paragons of faith. The Lord Commander Militant points to their victories and calls them essential. All of them are looking at the mask. None of them see what the mask is hiding. None of them want to. I spent 8 months embedded with the 143rd Siege Regiment on Atria Secundus, and in that time I learned that the true horror of the Death Korps has nothing to do with the enemies they face. The orcs were brutal. The heretics were cunning. The trench warfare was an endless meat grinder that turned men into paste and paste into mud, and mud into the foundation for the next wave of attacks. But the real nightmare was watching what the Krieger soldiers did to themselves, the invisible wounds that never bled, the screaming silence behind those rebreather masks. I learned that fanaticism is not strength. Fanaticism is what happens when you break something so completely that it can only function in one direction, and that direction is always toward death. To understand the Death Korps, you must first understand Krieg itself, and to understand Krieg is to understand what happens when a world tears itself apart so thoroughly that 500 years later its children are still trying to earn forgiveness for sins they never committed. The planet Krieg was once a jewel of the segmentum tempestus, a hive world of considerable industrial output and strategic importance, its population loyal to the Golden Throne and productive in their service to the Imperium. Then came the Civil War. The historical records are sparse, deliberately purged by the Departamento Administratum in the interest of maintaining morale, but the essential facts are brutally simple. The planetary governor and a significant portion of the military command declared independence from the Imperium. Krieg, they proclaimed, would no longer tie its young to the Imperial Guard or bend its knee to distant terror. The Loyalist forces, a colonel named Jerton and his regiments, refused to accept this heresy. What followed was not a war. It was planetary suicide conducted with industrial efficiency. Jerton knew he could not win a conventional conflict against the superior numbers and entrenched positions of the rebel forces. So he made a choice that would echo across 5 centuries and transform his world into a monument of perpetual penance. He ordered the deployment of atomic warheads across every major hive city, every strategic position, every population center where the rebellion had taken root. Krieg burned. The atmosphere became a toxic shroud. The hives collapsed into radioactive tombs. Billions died in the initial strikes, and billions more died in the nuclear winter that followed, choking on ash and poison, starving in the dark, killing each other over scraps of uncontaminated food and water. The war continued for another 500 years in the irradiated ruins, fought in the deep tunnels and underground hives, a grinding nightmare of attrition warfare where victory was measured in meters of contaminated soil reclaimed from the enemy. When the Imperium finally returned to Krieg, they found a world transformed. The surface was a blasted wasteland of ash dunes and skeletal hive ruins, the atmosphere still thick with radioactive particulates, the temperature locked in perpetual winter. The population had survived in the deep tunnel networks, and they had done more than survive. They had won. The descendants of Jerton's loyalists had fought for 5 centuries without support, without hope of relief, without any reward except the knowledge that they had remained faithful when faithfulness cost them everything. They had crushed the rebellion meter by meter, tunnel by tunnel, body by body, until nothing remained of the heretics except bones ground into the foundations of the new order. And in that crucible of endless suffering, they had forged a new culture, a new purpose, a new way of being human that excised every weakness and magnified every strength required for survival in a radioactive hell. The Imperium looked upon this devastated world and its grimly efficient population and saw an opportunity. Krieg requested permission to raise regiments for the Imperial Guard as penance for their world's sins. The Departamento Munitorum granted this request with enthusiasm. The Death Korps of Krieg was born not from tradition or pride but from guilt, an entire culture dedicated to atoning for a heresy that happened so long ago that nobody even remembered what the original rebels had actually wanted. Guilt became doctrine, shame became identity. The need for redemption became so deeply woven into the fabric of Krieger society that children grew up believing their very existence was a debt owed in blood to the Golden Throne. On Krieg, childhood does not exist as other worlds understand it. There are no games, no stories, no moments of innocent joy or careless play. There is only preparation. From the moment a Krieger child can walk, he is measured against the standard of the soldier he will become. The Vita-WOM facilities produce the bulk of the population, cloned from carefully selected genetic stock, bred for conformity and obedience and physical resilience. Natural births still occurred, but the children are gathered into the same regimental scholar facilities regardless of their origin, sorted by genetic markers and physical potential, assigned to cohorts that will become their only family. The instructors are veterans of the Death Korps, men and women who survived their service and returned to Krieg to shape the next generation. They do not teach, they condition. A Krieger child learns to wear his rebreather mask before he learns to write his name. The mask becomes a second skin, a permanent fixture, worn during every waking hour and most sleeping ones. The air on Krieg is toxic, yes, but the mask serves a deeper purpose than mere survival. It erases the face. It removes individuality. Behind the goggled lenses and Vox grill, every child looks identical to every other child, and this uniformity is intentional and essential. The instructors teach that faces are distractions, that personal identity is a form of selfishness, that the individual is worthless except as a component in the greater mechanism of the regiment. The child learns to see his own reflection and recognize nothing but the mask. The child learns that he is not a person. He is a number, a statistic, a unit of combat effectiveness measured in acceptable losses and projected attrition rates. The training is not cruel by Krieger standards because cruelty implies the infliction of unnecessary suffering, and nothing in the scholar is unnecessary. Every hardship has a purpose. Every punishment reinforces a lesson. The children are exposed to low levels of chemical agents to build tolerance. They are made to crawl through tunnels filled with smoke and darkness to overcome claustrophobia. They are denied food to teach them that hunger is just another sensation to be ignored. They are subjected to artillery simulations, the constant thunder of explosions and screaming of shells, until the sound of war becomes as familiar as their own breathing. They learn to sleep standing up, to eat without tasting, to endure pain without complaint. They learn that comfort is weakness, that hesitation is heresy, that the only acceptable outcome of any engagement is victory or death, and that death is often preferable because it requires fewer resources. Most importantly, they learn the doctrine of the Death Korps, the core philosophy that defines every action and thought. All life is the Emperor's currency, and it must be spent wisely but spent nonetheless. To live beyond your usefulness is to steal from the Golden Throne. To fear death is to doubt the Emperor's plan. To value your own existence above the mission is the first step toward the heresy that doomed Krieg in the first place. The instructors repeat these lessons until they become reflexive, until the children can recite them in their sleep, until the words are no longer words but the fundamental architecture of thought itself. A Krieger does not believe these things. A Krieger cannot conceive of not believing them. The alternatives have been systematically erased from his capacity for thought. By the age of 15, the child is no longer a child. He is a guardsman of the Death Korps of Krieg, and he understands his purpose with absolute clarity. He exists to die for the Emperor, and the only variables are when, where, and how effectively. There is no graduation ceremony, no moment of recognition or pride. One day you are in training, and the next day you are issued your full kit, assigned to a regiment, and loaded onto a transport bound for whatever war zone requires your particular form of service. The transition is seamless because there is no real difference between training and deployment. Both are simply different expressions of the same fundamental purpose. I watched them arrive on Atria Secundus in endless waves, regiment after regiment disembarking from the troopships with mechanical precision, forming up in the staging grounds without orders, moving like a single organism with 10,000 bodies. They did not speak to each other. They did not look around at their new environment or show any reaction to the constant artillery fire echoing across the plains. They simply assembled, received their deployment orders via data slate, and marched directly into the trench systems that had already consumed 3 Imperial Guard regiments and 2 companies of Astra Militarum armored support. The enemy held a fortified position along a ridgeline designated Target Priority Sigma, a network of bunkers and weapon emplacements that had resisted 6 months of conventional assault. The Departamento Munitorum estimated it would require another 4 months and approximately 40,000 casualties to reduce the position through orthodox siege tactics. The Death Korps took it in 11 days. The cost was 37,000 dead. The Departamento Munitorum classified the operation as highly efficient and recommended the tactical approach for future engagements of similar nature. I was assigned to the 143rd Siege Regiment as an observer and morale officer, and I spent those 11 days learning that efficiency and horror are not opposites, but rather different measurements of the same terrible mathematics. The Death Korps did not attack the fortifications with courage or determination or tactical brilliance. They attacked with the inevitability of a rising tide, wave after wave of gas-masked soldiers advancing across no man's land under withering fire, falling by the hundreds, the thousands, their bodies piling up in the mud and barbed wire, each wave using the corpses of the previous wave as cover, as stepping stones, as improvised fortifications. The enemy poured lasfire and bolter rounds and autocannon shells into the advancing masses, and the Death Korps absorbed it all with the same flat indifference a sponge shows to water. I stood in the command trench with Watchmaster Hohenstein, the senior officer of the 143rd, and watched through magnoculars as the third wave went over the top. They moved in perfect lines, bayonets fixed, lasguns held at precisely the regulation angle. The enemy opened fire when they reached the midpoint of no man's land, and the entire first rank collapsed as if they had walked into an invisible wall. Las bolts and solid rounds tore through greatcoats and flak armor, punching through flesh and bone, dropping Kriegers in mid-stride. They fell face first into the mud, and the rank behind them simply stepped over the bodies and continued forward. No hesitation, no attempt to take cover, no screaming or cursing or prayers to the Emperor. Just the steady tramp of boots through blood-soaked earth. The mechanical precision of soldiers who understood that their function was not to survive, but to advance until they could advance no more. I asked Hohenstein if we should call for artillery support, suppress the enemy positions, give the advancing infantry some cover. He did not lower his magnoculars. His voice came muffled and flat through his Rebreather Vox grill. Artillery would be inefficient. The enemy positions are hardened against indirect fire. Infantry assault is the optimal solution. Acceptable losses are within projected parameters. I asked him what those parameters were. He finally lowered the magnoculars and turned those goggled eyes toward me. Total casualties not to exceed 85% of committed forces. Current losses are at 42%. The assault will continue. 42%. More than 16,000 men dead in 3 days, and he called it acceptable. I have been a commissar for 20 years, and I have sent men to die for less than tactical advantage, but I had never heard someone calculate mass death with the same tone another man might use to discuss fuel consumption rates. I looked back at the battlefield and watched the fourth rank step over the third, watched them march into the same killing field that had just slaughtered their brothers, watched them die in exactly the same way, and I realized that Hohenstein was not being callous. He was being precise. The Death Korps had calculated exactly how many bodies it would take to overwhelm the enemy's ammunition supplies, to force them to overheat their weapons, to pile up enough corpses that the next wave could use them as firing positions. Every death served a purpose. Every corpse was a tactical asset. The horror was not that they were dying. The horror was that they were dying according to plan. By the 6th day, the corpses in no man's land formed a literal wall, a rampart of frozen flesh and shattered bone that provided cover for the advancing soldiers. The Death Korps engineers moved forward under covering fire and began reinforcing this wall with sandbags and razor wire, transforming their own dead into a forward trench system. I watched them work, watched them drag bodies into position with the same efficiency they showed handling ammunition crates. Watched them strip equipment from the corpses without any acknowledgement that these had been living men just hours before. One engineer was fortifying a section of the wall when he uncovered the face of his squad mate, identifiable by the unit marking on his helmet. The engineer paused for exactly 3 seconds, reached down, closed the dead man's eyes, and continued working. That 3-second pause was the only funeral rite the Death Korps allowed themselves. That brief moment of recognition was the only concession to grief their conditioning permitted. The breakthrough came on the 11th day when the Death Korps finally reached the enemy bunkers in sufficient numbers to overwhelm the defensive positions. They did not use explosives or flamers or any of the specialized equipment designed for bunker assault. They simply poured into the firing slits and access tunnels in endless numbers, absorbing casualties with the same flat indifference they had shown for the past 11 days, pushing forward over their own dead until the enemy positions were physically choked with corpses, and the defenders had no room to maneuver or retreat. The fighting inside the bunkers was close-range butchery, bayonets and entrenching tools and knives, the kind of intimate violence that breaks lesser men. The Death Korps performed it with mechanical efficiency. When I entered the bunkers after the position fell, I found Krieger soldiers calmly cleaning blood off their bayonets while standing ankle-deep in the mixed remains of enemy and friendly casualties. The stench was apocalyptic, the silence was worse. Target priority Sigma was reduced. The operation was logged as successful. The 143rd Siege Regiment received no commendations, no recognition, no acknowledgement of their sacrifice beyond a single-line entry in the Departamento Munitorum records, noting acceptable performance parameters. The survivors were given 6 hours to recover and rearm before receiving their next deployment orders. In that 6 hours, I watched them go through their post-battle routines with the same mechanical precision they showed in combat. They cleaned their weapons. They redistributed ammunition from the dead to the living. They filed casualty reports on data slates, listing names and identification numbers without commentary or emotion. They consumed their rations. They slept in shifts, still wearing their masks, still fully equipped, ready to resume combat at a moment's notice. I saw no prayers for the fallen. I heard no voices raised in grief or anger or relief. The Death Korps had lost 37,000 men, and they processed this loss with the same emotional investment a manufacturer shows when logging defective components. That night, I found Trooper 456-782 Gamma sitting alone in a collapsed section of trench, his rebreather mask tilted up just enough to expose his mouth so he could eat his ration bar. It was the first time I had seen a Krieger's face, and I wish I had not. He was young, perhaps 19 or 20, with pale skin and hollow cheeks and eyes that held no light whatsoever. Not the hardness of a veteran or the exhaustion of a soldier pushed beyond his limits. Just emptiness. A void where something human should have been. He was chewing his ration bar with slow, mechanical bites, and I realized he was not tasting it. He was simply processing fuel, converting calories into combat effectiveness with the same awareness a las rifle shows when converting energy packs into las bolts. I asked him his name. He swallowed, lowered his mask back over his mouth and told me his designation. I clarified, "Not your number, your name. What did your parents call you?" He tilted his head in that peculiar way Kriegers do when processing a question that does not fit their worldview. "I am Trooper 456-782 Gamma. My designation is my name. My origin is irrelevant to my function." I asked if he had any family on Krieg, anyone who would mourn him if he fell. He stood, adjusted his webbing, and told me that all Kriegers are brothers in service to the Emperor. Individual attachment is a distraction from duty. Then he walked away, back to his squad, back to the endless routine of maintenance and preparation, and I understood something that made my blood run cold. He was not reciting propaganda. He was not suppressing emotion for the sake of discipline. He genuinely did not understand the question, the concept of individual identity, of personal relationships, of a self that existed separate from his function as a soldier. These things had been so thoroughly erased from his conditioning that he could not even recognize them when presented directly. The Death Korps does not suppress emotion. Suppression implies that the emotion exists and is being controlled or hidden. What the Death Korps does is deeper and more terrible. They excise the capacity for emotion entirely, or rather they channel every possible emotional response into a single narrow outlet that serves the regiment's purpose. Fear becomes vigilance. Anger becomes combat efficiency. Love becomes loyalty to the regiment. Grief becomes a 3-second pause before resuming duty. Every human feeling is filtered through the lens of military function, and anything that cannot be made useful is simply edited out of the psyche like a corrupted line of code deleted from a data slate. What remains is not a soldier in the traditional sense. What remains is a biological machine that happens to be shaped like a man. I have heard other Imperial Guard regiments whisper about the Death Korps when they think no commissars are listening. They call them the walking dead. They say that Kriegers are corpses who have not yet realized they have stopped breathing. They tell stories of Krieger soldiers continuing to fight after sustaining wounds that should have dropped them instantly, held upright by sheer refusal to deviate from their assigned task. I dismissed these stories as the usual soldier's superstition, the tall tales men tell to process the horror of war. Then I saw a Krieger take a bolter round through the chest cavity, the explosive shell detonating inside his ribcage and blowing out his back in a spray of bone fragments and organ tissue. And he fired 3 more shots from his lasgun before his body understood it was dead and collapsed. I watched a Krieger engineer continue defusing a mine while his severed arm lay in the mud 3 meters away, using his remaining hand and his teeth to complete the task, finishing the job before allowing himself to acknowledge the injury. I saw a Krieger squad advance through a promethium fire that melted their gas masks to their faces, the rubber and metal fusing with flesh, and they continued their assault with their skin burning away, firing their weapons until their hands cooked off the triggers. The other regiments are right to fear them. Not because the Death Korps are deadly, though they are. Not because they are skilled warriors, though their training is comprehensive. They fear the Death Korps because looking at them is like looking into a mirror that shows not your reflection but your negation, the anti-image of everything that makes a soldier human. Courage requires fear to overcome. Honor requires choice. Sacrifice requires the thing being sacrificed to have value. The Death Korps have none of these things. They advance because they cannot conceive of not advancing. They die because they have been told their deaths serve a purpose, and they lack the capacity to question whether that purpose is worth the cost. They are the logical endpoint of absolute faith taken to its terminal extreme, and that endpoint is indistinguishable from damnation. The psychological cost of this conditioning is impossible to measure because the Death Korps lacks the vocabulary to describe it. They do not complain of nightmares because they have been trained to view sleep as merely a biological necessity requiring minimal time allocation. They do not speak of survivor's guilt because they have been taught that survival itself is a form of failure, a theft of resources that should have been allocated elsewhere. They do not suffer from combat fatigue because fatigue is just another sensation to be logged and ignored, but the cost exists nonetheless, visible in small details that reveal themselves only to those who watch closely enough. The slight hesitation before a Krieger removes his mask, as if the face underneath is something shameful that should remain hidden. The way their hands shake when they are alone, a minute tremor that vanishes the instant they become aware of observation. The fact that they never laugh, never sing, never engage in any of the small rituals of humanity that other soldiers use to maintain their sanity in the face of war's grinding horror. I found the evidence of this cost in the most unlikely place. The Kriegers maintained a small area in the rear trenches designated for equipment maintenance, and in one corner of this area, hidden behind a stack of ammunition crates, someone had scratched marks into the trench wall, hundreds of them. Thousands. Tiny scratches carved into the frozen earth with a knife or bayonet tip, each mark no larger than a fingernail. I thought at first they were counting something, perhaps enemy kills or days served, but the pattern was too chaotic, too frantic. They were not counting, they were screaming. Some Krieger soldier, during some moment of solitude in the endless grind of siege warfare, had found the only way his conditioning would allow him to express the unbearable weight of what he was enduring. He could not speak it. He could not write it. He could not even fully acknowledge it to himself. But he could make marks in the wall, each scratch a tiny rebellion against the emptiness. A desperate grasping for something, anything, that proved he was more than just a number and a designation. I never discovered who made those marks. The next day, that section of trench collapsed under artillery fire, and whoever had been carving their silent scream into the wall was buried under tons of earth and debris. His body was never recovered. His loss was logged as acceptable. The Death Korps fights in the worst conditions the Imperium can offer, because they are the only soldiers who will not break under those conditions, not because they are stronger, but because they lack the psychological framework necessary to break in the first place. You cannot shatter something that has already been reduced to its essential components. They are deployed to toxic worlds where the atmosphere dissolves lungs and the soil is saturated with chemical weapons that turn flesh into soup. They are sent to irradiated hellscapes where background radiation levels would kill an unprotected human in minutes. They are assigned to siege operations that measure progress in meters per year, grinding attritional nightmares where soldiers live and fight and die in trenches for decades without ever seeing the sky. The Death Korps accepts these deployments without protest, because protest is not within their capacity. They march into hell, and they do not blink because they were born in hell and trained in hell, and their entire existence is calibrated to function in hell. On Atria Secundus, we fought in a trench system that had been continuously occupied for 7 years. The original regiment that dug those trenches was long dead, replaced by reinforcements who died and were replaced again. Layer upon layer of soldiers feeding themselves into the meat grinder, until the trenches themselves were built from corpses as much as earth. The walls wept with contaminated groundwater. The duckboards floated on a layer of mud mixed with human remains. The air was thick with chemical fog from both sides using gas weapons, and the constant artillery made the ground shake with seismic regularity. Men from other regiments lasted weeks in those conditions before they started showing signs of psychological breakdown. The Death Korps lasted until they were killed, and even then their bodies served as structural reinforcement for the trench walls. I walked those trenches every day as part of my commissariat duties, monitoring morale and watching for signs of cowardice or heresy. In 7 months, I never once had to execute a Krieger for dereliction of duty. Not because they were paragons of discipline, though their obedience was absolute, but because they lacked the imagination necessary to conceive of disobedience. Orders were not requests to be considered and obeyed. Orders were fundamental laws of reality, as fixed and immutable as gravity. Telling a Krieger to advance was not substantially different from telling a rock to fall. The outcome was inevitable not because of choice, but because the alternative did not exist within the framework of their understanding. But I executed plenty of soldiers from other regiments attached to our position. Men who broke under the endless shelling, who tried to desert through the rear lines, who put their lasguns under their chins and pulled the trigger, because even a bolt through the skull was preferable to one more day in the trenches. I shot them in front of their squads as the regulations required, and every time I did, I saw the Kriegers watching with those flat, goggled eyes, and I knew they were not learning the lesson I was supposed to be teaching. They were not thinking, I must maintain discipline or face execution. They were thinking, those men were defective. Their weakness has been corrected. The regiment's efficiency is restored. To them, my summary executions were not punishment, but quality control, the removal of faulty components from the greater machine. The Departamento Munitorum publishes casualty statistics for every regiment in the Imperial Guard, and these statistics are public record, available to anyone with the clearance to access military archives. The Death Korps of Krieg maintains an average casualty rate of 73% over a standard 5-year deployment cycle. This means that in the time it takes an average guardsman to complete a single tour of duty, nearly 3/4 of every Krieger regiment is killed and replaced. Some theaters push that number higher. The Siege of Vrax, a campaign that lasted 17 years, consumed 14 million Death Korps soldiers, 14 million men fed into a single meat grinder over less than 2 decades. Their bodies piled so high in some sectors that the corpse walls reached 3 stories tall and required engineering teams to prevent collapse. The Departamento Munitorum classified Vrax as a successful operation. The Death Korps received a single line of commendation in the official records. No names were listed. No individual heroism was recognized. The 14 million dead were reduced to a footnote in a logistics report, notable only for the efficiency with which they accomplished their objective. These numbers are not aberrations. They are the standard. Every campaign the Death Korps fights follows the same pattern, the same brutal mathematics of acceptable loss. They do not retreat. They do not surrender. They do not request relief or reinforcement beyond what is necessary to maintain minimum operational capacity. They advance until the objective is taken or until every last soldier is dead, and if they die before the objective falls, The next regiment simply continues from where the previous one stopped. The line never breaks because the line cannot conceive of breaking. The advance never falters because faltering is not within their operational parameters. They are the Imperium's answer to the unsolvable problem, the human wave that crashes against every obstacle until either the obstacle breaks or the wave is spent, and there are always more waves waiting in the troop ships above. I watched this process unfold across 8 months on Atria Secundus, watched regiment after regiment arrive and march into the trenches and die and get replaced, the cycle turning with industrial regularity. The 1/4 Siege Regiment was replaced by the 89th, who were replaced by the 210th, who were replaced by the 456th. Each regiment wore the same uniform, carried the same equipment, fought with the same tactics. The faces behind the masks were different, but the masks themselves were identical, and after a while I stopped being able to tell one regiment from another. They were not individual units with distinct identities and histories. They were interchangeable components in a vast machine designed for a single purpose, and that purpose was the conversion of human life into tactical advantage. The enemy we fought on Atria Secundus were heretics, former imperial citizens who had turned from the Emperor's light and embraced the ruinous powers. They fought with desperation and cunning, using every trick and tactic available to defenders who knew they would receive no mercy if they surrendered. They collapsed tunnels on advancing Krieger squads. They poisoned water supplies. They rigged corpses with explosives and left them in positions where the Death Korps would recover them for identification. Every dirty trick, every underhanded stratagem, every violation of what few rules of warfare still existed in the grim darkness of the far future. The heretics threw everything they had at the Death Korps, and it made no difference whatsoever. The Death Korps absorbed every blow, every trap, every desperate gambit, and continued grinding forward with the same mechanical inevitability. There was a particular engagement during the 6th month that exemplified this dynamic. The heretics had fortified a water reclamation facility that supplied both their positions and ours. Taking it would give us control of the region's water supply and force the enemy to either withdraw or die of thirst. The facility was protected by a minefield containing an estimated 30,000 anti-personnel mines, some conventional explosive, others loaded with chemical payloads designed to create casualties that would burden the enemy's medical resources. A standard military approach would involve engineers clearing lanes through the minefield, a slow process requiring specialized equipment and trained personnel. The Death Korps had a simpler solution. They sent 2 companies of infantry walking across the minefield in extended line formation, spacing the men far enough apart that each mine would only kill 1 or 2 soldiers. They cleared the minefield by detonating every single mine with their own bodies, and the companies behind them simply walked through the cleared lanes toward the objective. I watched this happen from an observation post, watched through binoculars as hundreds of men stepped on mines and vanished in explosions of earth and flesh, watched the neat lines ripple and reform as soldiers fell and the gaps closed automatically, watched the chemical mines release their payloads and watched the men who breathed those chemicals collapse and convulse and die, while their brothers stepped over them without pause. It took 40 minutes to clear the minefield. It cost 843 lives. The engineers estimated that conventional mine clearing would have taken 6 days and resulted in perhaps 30 casualties. The Death Korps method was objectively less efficient in terms of lives spent, but it was faster, and speed had tactical value that outweighed the cost in personnel. 843 men died to save 6 days. The watchmaster who ordered the advance logged it as an acceptable trade. The men who walked into those mines did so without hesitation, because hesitation was not within their capacity. When I questioned this decision, when I suggested that perhaps preserving trained soldiers might have long-term advantages that outweighed short-term tactical gains, Watchmaster Hohenstein looked at me with those dead goggled eyes and explained in his flat mechanical voice that I was miscalculating the variables. Trained soldiers can be replaced. Time cannot. The enemy uses every hour we give them to strengthen their defenses. Every day we delay is another day they fortify their position. The Emperor's enemies do not rest, neither can we. His logic was flawless. His logic was monstrous. His logic was the only framework the Death Korps possessed for making decisions, a calculus that reduced every choice to pure mathematics stripped of any human consideration. The water reclamation facility fell 3 hours after the minefield was cleared. The cost was another 2,000 casualties. The strategic advantage gained was significant. The heretics began withdrawing from the entire sector within days, their water supplies exhausted, their ability to maintain their defensive positions compromised. The Departamento Munitorum classified the operation as highly successful and recommended similar tactics for future engagements. 3,643 men died to secure a single facility, and their deaths were celebrated as proof of efficiency, as evidence that the Death Korps methods worked, as justification for continuing to deploy them in exactly the same manner. The mathematics were perfect, the humanity was absent. But mathematics cannot account for what happens inside a mind when that mind is forced to function, without the basic psychological structures that make consciousness bearable. The Death Korps does not permit its soldiers to acknowledge fear or grief or pain. But these things do not simply vanish because they are forbidden. They go somewhere else. They accumulate in the spaces between thoughts, in the brief moments before sleep, in the 3-second pause when a Krieger closes his dead brother's eyes before returning to duty. The pressure builds because it has nowhere to go, no release valve, no healthy outlet. A normal soldier processes combat trauma through conversation with his fellows, through dark humor, through letters home to loved ones, through the small rituals that acknowledge what he has endured. The Death Korps has none of these mechanisms. They have only duty and silence and the endless grinding forward. I found evidence of what this pressure does during a routine inspection of the sleeping quarters in the deep bunkers behind the front lines. These bunkers were carved into the bedrock beneath the trenches, supposedly safe from artillery, though nothing on Atria Secundus was truly safe. The Kriegers slept in shifts on metal racks stacked 4 high, still wearing their masks, still in full kit, ready to respond to alerts at any moment. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and stale recycled atmosphere. The only sound was breathing, the mechanical wheeze of hundreds of rebreathers inhaling and exhaling in imperfect synchronization. I moved through the rows of sleeping soldiers with a portable illuminator, conducting the standard security checks for contraband or heretical materials. In the back corner of the deepest bunker level, I found a Krieger who was not sleeping. He sat on his rack with his back against the stone wall, his rebreather mask tilted up just enough to expose his mouth, and he was eating his own hand. Not quickly, not frantically, but with the same methodical precision he would apply to any other task. He had removed 2 fingers already, chewing through the flesh and bone, consuming them completely. He was working on the 3rd when my illuminator beam found him. He looked up at me, and in his eyes I saw something that made my blood freeze. Not madness. Madness would have been a relief. What I saw was awareness. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew it was wrong. But the pressure inside his skull had built to such unbearable levels that inflicting pain on himself was the only way his conditioning would permit him to acknowledge that something was wrong, that he was suffering, that the machine was breaking down. I called for the medica immediately, but by the time they arrived the Krieger had swallowed the 3rd finger and started on the 4th. They had to restrain him, and even restrained he continued trying to bite through whatever flesh he could reach, his own or theirs. The medica sedated him, took him away, and filed a report classifying him as combat ineffective due to psychological breakdown. I never learned what happened to him after that. The Death Korps does not maintain records of individual soldiers beyond their tactical deployment. Once a Krieger becomes non-functional, he vanishes from the system as efficiently as if he had died. Perhaps more efficiently, because at least the dead get logged as casualties. The broken simply disappear. I asked the medica if this was common. The senior chirurgeon, a veteran who had served with the Death Korps for 15 years, told me he saw similar cases every few months, Self-mutilation, catatonia, complete psychological shutdown. Soldiers whose conditioning simply collapsed under weights it was never designed to bear indefinitely. The Death Korps trains its soldiers to function without emotional release for the duration of a standard combat deployment, usually 6 months to 2 years. But some campaigns last decades. Some Kriegers serve for 10, 15, 20 years in continuous combat zones without ever rotating back to Krieg, without ever receiving rest or recovery time beyond the minimum required for physical healing. The conditioning is not infinite. Eventually, something breaks. The chirurgeon told me the Death Korps considers this acceptable. A soldier who lasts 15 years before breakdown has provided far more tactical value than the resources invested in his creation and training. His eventual psychological collapse is simply the end of his useful service life, no different than a lasgun that finally fails after decades of hard use. I wanted to be horrified by this. I wanted to rage against the casual inhumanity of treating soldiers like equipment to be used until they broke and discarded. But I had been a commissar for too long. I understood the mathematics. The Imperium requires the Death Korps. The enemies of mankind do not negotiate or compromise. They must be fought and destroyed, and fighting them requires soldiers who can endure conditions that would break normal men. If the Death Korps did not exist, someone would have to invent them, because the alternative is letting the enemies of humanity win. The moral calculus is brutally simple. Individual suffering is irrelevant when measured against species survival. The Death Korps understands this. They volunteer for this. Every Krieger who takes up arms does so knowing exactly what awaits him, and he marches toward that fate without complaint, because he has been taught from birth that his suffering serves a greater purpose. But does it? That is the question that haunted me through every day I served alongside the Death Korps. The question I could never answer satisfactorily. Does their sacrifice truly serve the Emperor's vision for humanity? Or have we simply found a way to perpetuate suffering with such efficiency that we mistake it for virtue? The Death Korps fights in the Emperor's name, but the Emperor, enthroned in gold and agony upon terror, cannot tell us whether their endless dying pleases him or horrifies him. We assume his approval. We take their effectiveness as proof of his blessing. But what if we are wrong? What if the Death Korps is not the solution to humanity's survival, but rather evidence of how far we have fallen? How completely we have abandoned the values that made humanity worth saving in the first place? The Imperium celebrates the Death Korps as paragons of sacrifice, as living embodiments of absolute faith. The Ecclesiarchy preaches sermons about their devotion. The Departamento Munitorum points to their casualty rates as proof that proper conditioning can overcome any obstacle. Planetary governors across the Imperium have tried to replicate Krieg's methods, implementing similar training regimes for their own Tither regiments, though none have achieved the same results because they lack the 5 centuries of cultural reinforcement that makes a true Krieger. We hold them up as the ideal, the standard against which all other soldiers are measured and found wanting. We tell ourselves their suffering is noble, their deaths are meaningful, their sacrifice is the purest expression of faith in the Golden Throne. But I have stood in the trenches with them. I have watched them die. I have seen what the mask is hiding, and what I have learned is that the Death Korps of Krieg are not heroes. They are victims. Victims of a history they did not create, of sins they did not commit, of a culture that has weaponized guilt so effectively that an entire population believes their sole purpose is to die as efficiently as possible. They march into hell not because they are brave, but because bravery requires choice, and choice requires the capacity to imagine alternatives. The Death Korps has no alternatives. They have only duty and death, and these two concepts have been so thoroughly conflated in their conditioning that they cannot distinguish between them. The other Imperial Guard regiments recognize this on some instinctive level, even if they cannot articulate it. That is why they fear the Death Korps. That is why they avoid interacting with them beyond operational necessity. Looking at a Krieger is like looking at a future that awaits all of us if we are not careful. A future where humanity becomes so focused on survival that we forget what makes survival worthwhile. The Death Korps is the logical endpoint of faith without mercy, duty without compassion, sacrifice without meaning. They are what happens when we strip away every human quality except obedience and call the result holy. I left Atria Secundus after 8 months, reassigned to a new theater where my services as a commissar were required. The Death Korps was still fighting when I departed, still grinding forward meter by meter, still feeding men into the trenches with mechanical regularity. The campaign eventually ended in Imperial victory, though it took another 3 years and consumed 6 more regiments. The total casualty count exceeded 90,000, with the Death Korps accounting for more than 80% of the losses. The planet was reclaimed for the Imperium. The heretics were purged. The strategic objectives were achieved. The Departamento Munitorum classified the operation as successful and moved on to planning the next deployment. But I cannot move on. The faces behind those masks haunt me, or rather the absence of faces, the terrible void where personality and identity and humanity should exist. I dream about them sometimes, rows of goggled eyes staring at me from the darkness, asking questions in their flat mechanical voices. What is my designation? What are my operational parameters? Have my losses exceeded acceptable levels? They never ask why. They never question the purpose of their suffering. They only seek confirmation that they are functioning correctly, that their deaths will serve the Emperor, that their sacrifice means something beyond the simple mathematics of attrition warfare. I cannot give them that confirmation because I do not know if it exists. I have seen the Death Korps deployed across a dozen war zones, have watched them die in 100 different ways, and I still cannot determine whether their sacrifice serves any purpose beyond perpetuating itself. They die to take objectives that will be abandoned next year. They bleed for ground that has no strategic value beyond forcing the enemy to bleed as well. They march into meat grinders that could be avoided with better tactics or more patience or a willingness to accept slower progress. But the Imperium does not have patience. The Imperium does not value individual lives over expedient solutions. The Imperium needs the Death Korps to be exactly what they are, an inexhaustible supply of soldiers who will die without complaint. And so we train them and deploy them and spend them like currency. And we tell ourselves their deaths matter, because the alternative is admitting that we are feeding our own children into a machine that serves no purpose except its own perpetuation. The worst part is that the Death Korps would not want my pity, even if they could understand it. They would reject any suggestion that their sacrifice is meaningless or their suffering is preventable. They have been conditioned so completely to believe in the righteousness of their purpose that questioning it would be tantamount to heresy in their minds. They want to die for the Emperor. They beg for the opportunity to prove their worth through death. Denying them this would be, from their perspective, the cruelest thing the Imperium could do, and perhaps that is the greatest horror of all, that we have created a population so thoroughly broken that they cannot imagine healing, so completely enslaved to their guilt that they mistake freedom for punishment. So the cycle continues. Krieg produces more regiments. The Departamento Munitorum deploys them to the worst hellholes in the galaxy. They die in their tens of thousands, their hundreds of thousands, their millions. The propaganda reels celebrate their devotion. The ecclesiarchy holds them up as examples of proper faith. Young soldiers in other regiments look at the Death Korps and feel inadequate because their own devotion seems weak by comparison. And somewhere in the deep tunnels of Krieg, another generation of children is learning to wear their masks, learning to value death over life, learning that their faces are shameful things that must be hidden, learning that they are numbers and designations rather than human beings with inherent worth. I am a commissar of the Officio Prefectus, and my duty is to maintain morale and discipline within the Imperial Guard through whatever means necessary. I have executed cowards and heretics without hesitation. I have sent men to certain death when tactical necessity demanded it. I believe in the Imperium and the Emperor and the righteousness of our endless war against the darkness. But I cannot look at the Death Korps of Krieg and see righteousness. I can only see the cost, the terrible price we pay when we decide that efficiency matters more than humanity, that victory justifies any sacrifice, that faith excuses any cruelty. The Death Korps will never acknowledge this cost. They cannot. Acknowledging it would require them to possess the very qualities their conditioning has excised: the capacity for self-reflection and doubt, and the recognition that suffering is not automatically noble simply because it is endured in service to a cause. They will continue fighting until every last one of them is dead, and Krieg will continue producing replacements, and the machine will grind on forever, because that is what machines do. They function according to their design until something external forces them to stop, and nothing in the Imperium possesses the authority or the will to stop the Death Korps. In the end, I am left with only questions and no answers. Is the Death Korps necessary for the Imperium's survival, or have we simply become dependent on their sacrifice because it is easier than finding better solutions? Do they truly serve the Emperor, or have we created a cult of death that worships suffering for its own sake? Are they the pinnacle of human devotion, or are they the clearest evidence that the Imperium has lost sight of what humanity is supposed to mean? I do not know. I suspect nobody knows, not the Fabricator General on Mars, not the High Lords of Terror, perhaps not even the Emperor himself in whatever shattered consciousness still lingers within the Golden Throne. What I do know is this: the next time you see propaganda footage of the Death Korps of Krieg, the next time you watch them march in perfect formation across some blasted hellscape, the next time you hear their casualty rates quoted as proof of proper devotion, remember what I have told you. Remember that behind every mask is a human being who has been systematically destroyed and rebuilt as something that only resembles human. Remember that every Krieger soldier is the product of 5 centuries of trauma processed into doctrine, of guilt weaponized into culture, of an entire world that has never stopped punishing itself for sins committed by people who died before their great-grandparents were born. Remember that their silence is not strength, but the absence of any voice left to scream. Remember that their sacrifice is not noble but necessary in the way that amputating a gangrenous limb is necessary, a terrible choice made because all alternatives are worse. The Death Korps of Krieg will never tell you these things. They will simply continue advancing toward the next objective, dying in the next trench, fulfilling the next deployment order with the same mechanical efficiency they have always shown. They will never complain. They will never break. They will never question, and that, more than any Xeno's horror or heretical abomination, is the true terror that should haunt anyone who stops to consider what they represent. They are humanity stripped down to its most basic function, and told that this diminishment is enlightenment, that losing everything that makes life worth living is the price of serving a cause worth dying for. They are the question the Imperium refuses to ask itself given physical form and sent to die in the Emperor's name. I served alongside them for 8 months, and I will carry the weight of what I witnessed for the rest of my life. Every time I close my eyes, I see that Krieger with his intestines hanging from his stomach, asking if his combat effectiveness had fallen below acceptable parameters. I see Trooper 456782 Gamma with his empty eyes, unable to understand why anyone would ask his name. I see the scratches on the trench wall, the silent scream of a soldier who had no other way to prove he still existed. I see 843 men walking deliberately into a minefield dying to save 6 days. I see all of this, and I understand that the Death Korps of Krieg are both the Imperium's greatest weapon and its most damning indictment, proof that we can justify anything, endure anything, sacrifice anything, as long as we convince ourselves the cause is righteous and the Emperor approves. The mask hides the face, but what lies beneath the mask is not a secret or a mystery. It is simply absence. The hollow space where a human being used to exist before we decided that humanity was a luxury the Imperium could not afford. The Death Korps of Krieg are heroes to some, monsters to others, and tools to the Departmento Munitorum. But to themselves, they are nothing except numbers waiting to be subtracted from the ledger, acceptable losses in a war that has no end and no victory, only the grinding continuation of existence through violence. That is the truth beyond the mask. That is the untold terror of Krieg. Not that they die, but that they do so believing their deaths are the only thing about them that matters, and we have built an entire culture dedicated to ensuring they never learn otherwise.